Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today, we're diving into the world of Hogwarts' most charming rule breakers, Fred and George Weasley. They were the life of the party, the mischief makers who could bring laughter even in the darkest moments. But their sense of humor wasn't always harmless. There were times when their pranks crossed the line. Let's take a closer look at the Weasley twins' most controversial antics. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Testing on first years. After Harry gave the twins his Triwizard Tournament winnings, they began developing their own line of magical products. But before opening a shop, they needed to test them. And their test subjects became first-year students. Hermione was furious and demanded they stop the madness. But Fred and George, as if deaf to her protests, continued using younger students to trial their inventions. The result? The hospital wing was overflowing. Number 2, Snowballs and Professor Quirrell. In their first year at Hogwarts, the twins enchanted Snowballs to chase Professor Quirrell and smack him on the back of the head, right where Voldemort was secretly attached. Of course, they didn't know that, but still mocking a weak, stuttering teacher. Is that really a joke? Number 3, a spider instead of a teddy bear. Ron's fear of spiders is legendary, but few know where it came from. When Ron was just 3, the twins, for a laugh, turned his beloved teddy bear into a giant spider, all over a broken toy broomstick. It may have seemed like sibling squabbling, but the trauma stayed with Ron for life. Number 4, the Egyptian trap for Percy. During a family trip to Egypt, Fred and George tried to prank their older brother Percy by luring him into a pyramid and locking him in. Had the prank succeeded, it could have ended far worse. One wrong turn and Percy might have been trapped forever. Fun? Not quite. Number 5, the Vanishing Cabinet and Montague. In a clash with members of Dolores Umbridge's inquisitorial squad, the twins shoved Montague into a vanishing cabinet. He ended up stuck in a magical void between spaces and only managed to escape after a painful attempt at apparition. And Fred and George, they recounted the event with a grin, like it was just harmless fun. But Montague, he nearly died. Number 6, the Unbreakable Vow and Little Ron. One day, the twins thought it would be funny to make 5-year-old Ron take an unbreakable vow, a magical oath that results in death if broken. Only Arthur Weasley's intervention stopped the madness. Later, Ron said it was the only time he'd seen his father as angry as their mother. Luckily, the joke didn't go through, but the fact they even tried is terrifying. Number 7, a joke shop, or something more. Fred and George's joke shop is their pride, but look closer, and some products carry serious consequences. Love potions that override someone's free will. Remember, Ron was badly affected. Or Peruvian instant darkness powder, which Draco Malfoy later used to sneak Death Eaters into Hogwarts. A bit too much firepower disguised as fun. Number 8, extendable ears and breached privacy. Fred and George called them extendable ears, flesh-coloured strings long and twitchy that slithered under doors and heard everything. Finally, George grinned, Mum's secrets are ours. They weren't for sale yet. The twins tested them on their favourite lab rats, the Weasley family. One night, voices drifted through the floorboards. Molly, Arthur, serious tones. Fred dropped the ear. George pressed close. They heard the name. Voldemort. Whispers turned sharp. Disappearance in Dover. The Bones family. He's gathering strength. The boys froze. They'd expected gossip, not war. Instead of keeping quiet, they rushed to Jinny, told her every word. They said someone might attack. Fred whispered. Soon. Jinny turned pale. Here. Her hands shook. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window with her wand clutched tight, just in case. Molly found her at dawn, eyes red. When she learned the truth, she didn't yell, just looked at the twins and said, That wasn't your secret to share. No lecture, no howler, just quiet, cold disappointment, the worst kind. The ears ended up in a drawer, tangled and silent. Fred didn't joke about it again. George muttered, Some things we're not meant to hear. Number 9. Magical fireworks and chaos in Hogwarts. It was chaos wrapped in brilliance. Fred and George launched enchanted fireworks across the castle in a storm of sparks, smoke, and magical beasts that roared through the halls. Dragons exploded in mid-air. Firecrackers wrote insults in flaming letters above classrooms. One soared into Umbridge's office and turned her hair bright blue. Students cheered, teachers ducked, Peeves saluted. It was a rebellion. Bold, unforgettable, and loud enough to shake the portraits on the walls. But the damage lingered. Alicia Spinnet got a burn on her arm. Dennis Creevey tripped over a smoking rocket and broke his glasses. A suit of armor crashed into the Charms corridor. "This is not freedom," McGonagall said, surveying the wreckage. Even Dumbledore, who admired cleverness, looked weary as he restored the broken stained glass. The twins vanished in triumph, but what they left behind wasn't just laughter. It was scorched stone, singed robes, and a question no one voiced out loud. Had they gone too far this time? Number 10. The fake fortune-teller prank on Neville. It looked like a toy, shiny, gold-trimmed, with a spinning crystal on top and smoke inside the globe. Fred called it the Oracle Orb. George claimed it could see a week into the future. "Just place your hand on the runes," he said, "and fate will do the rest." Neville Longbottom hesitated. "Are you sure it's safe?" Fred grinned. "Neville, it's practically Dumbledore approved." That should have been the first warning. Neville pressed his hand to the runes. The globe lit up. Smoke swirled. A cold voice echoed from within. "You will lose everything you love." Silence fell. Fred froze. George blinked. Neville stared at the orb like it had slapped him. "What does that mean?" he whispered. George mumbled, "Just the random setting." But it was too late. The damage was done. Neville stood, pale, and left the common room without a word. For the next 2 days he barely spoke. He skipped herbology, snapped at Seamus. At dinner he just pushed peas around his plate. Hermione noticed. "Something's wrong," she told Harry. Ron guessed it instantly. "Fred and George?" he muttered. "It's always Fred and George." When Professor Sprout asked Neville a question and he didn't even hear her, she pulled him aside. That's when the full story came out. And Fred, for once, didn't laugh when McGonagall called him in. They retired the orb. George tried to apologize. It wasn't supposed to say that, it was all random. But Neville just looked at him. "You made it," he said quietly. "You chose the words." Fred said nothing. The Oracle Orb ended up at the bottom of their toy chest, never spoken of again. Some jokes echo longer than others, and some, like this one, leave behind silence. Number 11. Hermione's magically dyed hair. Hermione Granger was never afraid to stand up to Fred and George, especially when it came to rules. She caught them testing joke candies on first years and marched straight to them with that fierce prefect glare. "You could hurt someone," she snapped. Fred smirked. George rolled his eyes. They didn't take it well, so they plotted payback, subtle, clever, and humiliating. The next morning, Hermione drank her usual calming potion before charms, but it had been tampered with. As soon as she walked into the classroom, her bushy hair turned a vivid glowing green. Not just green, blindingly green, like an enchanted forest had exploded on her head. Students gasped, then burst out laughing. "Nice look, Granger," someone shouted. Even Flitwick choked on his tea. Hermione's face went red, then white, then red again. She tried every counterspell she knew. Nothing worked. Her voice cracked as she muttered "finite incantatame" for the 5th time. Still green, she stormed out before class ended. Fred and George high-fived in the hallway. "Brilliant hue, don't you think?" George said. But Ron didn't laugh. "You crossed the line," he told them. "Fix it. And say sorry." It took hours for the colour to fade. Hermione refused to speak to anyone. That evening, she sat alone in the common room, wrapped in a blanket, her hair finally back to brown. Fred mumbled an apology. George offered a box of peppermint toads. She didn't touch them. "I don't need jokes," she said coldly. "I need respect." For once, the twins had no comeback, just silence, and maybe, for a moment, a flicker of guilt. Number 12. Lee Jordan's trapped briefcase. Lee Jordan thought he'd seen it all. Fireworks in the dorms, singing spiders in the shower, even a pudding that bit back. But nothing topped the exploding briefcase. Fred and George had built it just for him. A perfect replica of his school bag, only this one burst open with a cloud of bright green sneeze slime the moment it was unlatched. "He'll love it," Fred said. "He'll cry laughing," George added. They slipped it onto Lee's bench right before potions. Perfect timing, perfect trap. But then Snape walked in, early, silent, like a storm about to hit. He grabbed the briefcase, what with the wrong one, snapped it open with his usual scowl, and vanished in a violent blast of slime. It hit him full in the face, splattered across his robes, soaked the blackboard. Students shrieked, slime dripped from the ceiling. One Hufflepuff started coughing uncontrollably. Snape didn't blink, just stared, frozen, green mucus sliding down his hooked nose. "Out!" he growled. "Now!" Lee didn't even know what had happened, but Snape had already decided. "Mr. Jordan, your sense of humor is as revolting as your handwriting," he spat. No explanation helped. No one believed him, not even McGonagall. Fred and George stayed quiet. Lee got stuck scrubbing cauldrons for a week. His robes stank for days, and that night he didn't sit with the twins at dinner. He sat alone. Fred brought chocolate frogs. George offered slime-proof boots. But Lee didn't laugh. "You watched me get blamed," he said. "You didn't say a word." Fred tried to joke, but the spark was gone. "Come on, it was legendary," George said weakly. Lee stood. "Yeah, legendary betrayal." He walked away. The twins watched him go. For once, no one was laughing. Number 13, nose-biting teacups and their misuse. Colin Creevey wanted to do well. He always tried his best, even if his robes were wrinkled and his hand shook when he raised it in class. So when Fred and George offered him a self-writing quill before a history of magic exam, he smiled with gratitude. "It writes for you," Fred had said. "Just sit back and let your brain rest." George added with a wink, "Professor Binns won't know what hit him." But the quill had its own ideas. As Colin sat nervously in the exam hall, the quill began scratching at the parchment with wild energy. At first he was thrilled. Then he read the words. The Goblin Rebellion of 1612 was led by a dancing teapot named Gregor the Wobbly. Another line read, Hippogriffs are allergic to homework and often eat cauldrons to relieve stress. Colin tried to stop it, but the quill jerked out of his hand and continued on its own. When Binns collected the papers, he raised a ghostly eyebrow for the first time in decades. Later that day, Colin was called into Professor McGonagall's office. She held up his parchment like it was a cursed artifact. "Mr. Creevey," she said sharply, "what exactly were you trying to accomplish by handing in this nonsense?" Colin burst into tears. He stammered through the explanation, wiping his nose on his sleeve, voice breaking as he said, "I thought it was real. I thought it would help." McGonagall sighed and gently placed the paper on her desk. "Next time, Mr. Creevey, rely on your own mind. It's much better than you think." Number 14. Turning Jinny's hamster into a light show. Ginny Weasley adored her pets. Among them, a little hamster named Nibbles was her favourite. She carried him everywhere, even tried to knit him a tiny Gryffindor scarf. But to Fred and George, Nibbles was just another opportunity. "Let's make him legendary," Fred had whispered with a grin one rainy afternoon. What followed was one of their most chaotic ideas yet. Using a combination of levitation, lumos, and a marching charm they barely understood, the twins enchanted the poor creature. It started innocently. Nibbles ran along the ceiling, glowing like a torch, squeaking out the Goblin War anthem in tiny bursts. At first, Jinny laughed. So did Ron, but the charm spun out of control. Nibbles began to panic, darting wildly from wall to wall until, poof, he leapt into the fireplace and vanished into the Floo network. Jinny screamed. The room went silent. Then she cried, loudly, for hours. "He's gone! she sobbed to Molly that evening, "and it's their fault." Fred and George tried to explain. They hadn't meant for it to go that far, but no one was listening. Even Arthur looked grim. Molly, red-faced and shaking, pointed to the stairs and shouted, "If you ever do something like this again, I swear I'll send you two to Azkaban myself." The twins hid in their room for the next 2 days. Jinny wouldn't speak to them. Her eyes were swollen, her voice hoarse. In Order of the Phoenix, Jinny later says, "People always think Fred and George are harmless, but they never see the mess they leave behind." This was one of those moments. A joke that started with sparks and ended in ashes. Number 15. Slime in the Slytherin Goblet. It was supposed to be a rare evening of peace. The Great Hall of Hogwarts had never looked so breathtaking. Banners of all 4 houses draped in perfect symmetry across the enchanted ceiling, which shimmered with soft golden light. Tables had been rearranged to encourage mingling, not rivalry, and there was even a moment when the students of Gryffindor and Slytherin laughed together over a joke involving a charmed treacle tart that refused to be eaten. But, as anyone with a grain of sense should have known, peace at Hogwarts was a delicate creature, and if there was one surefire way to destroy it, it was to leave Fred and George Weasley unattended for too long. The twins had been in a particularly creative mood that week. Their latest venture involved experimenting with an experimental line of products for Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, a prototype series they lovingly dubbed Explosive Emotions. But this evening, they weren't looking to test anything commercial. This was purely for sport, mischief, and mayhem. "Imagine their faces," Fred had whispered, behind a stack of pumpkin pasties, his eyes gleaming. "They'll be picking slime out of their hair for weeks." "I vote for Bulstrode," George replied, casting a meaningful glance across the room, where Millicent Bulstrode sat with a permanent scowl. She's due for a little sparkle in her life. The target was the ornate silver goblet placed ceremoniously on the Slytherin table, a traditional heirloom used only for events deemed worthy by Professor Snape himself. Its emerald-encrusted rim glinted under the ceiling's golden shimmer, and it was filled, as usual, with dark mulled mead that had been specially brewed for the occasion. At least it had been. Before the evening began, Fred had slipped a few drops of his concoction into the goblet when no one was looking. The slime spell, carefully disguised under a layer of traditional charm work, was designed to remain dormant until touched by a particular combination of magical signature and physical contact. And as fate would have it, that combination happened to be Millicent Bulstrode's thick-fingered grip. The moment her fingers curled around the goblet, it responded like a beast uncaged. A bubbling hiss echoed across the table, followed by a sound that could only be described as a wet belch. Without warning, a column of thick, neon-green slime shot upward like a geyser, exploding into a gelatinous waterfall that poured directly onto Millicent's face. There was a beat of silence. Just one, just long enough for everyone to comprehend what they were seeing. Then came the chaos. Millicent screeched, but the slime muffled most of it. It was as if she had been dipped headfirst into a vat of frog spawn. The sludge coated her dark robes, matted her hair into slick tendrils, and ran in slow trails over her face. She stumbled backward, knocking over a pitcher of pumpkin juice and tripping into Daphne Greengrass, who shrieked as a strand of slime slapped across her arm like a living whip. "What in Merlin's name?" Snape's voice boomed, cold as ice and twice as sharp. He had risen from his seat like an avenging spectre, eyes immediately scanning the hall for the source of the curse. Fred and George tried to look innocent, tried being the operative word. "You!" Snape's gaze landed on them with unerring precision. "Did I not specifically say no unsanctioned magic during the inter-house celebration?" George blinked. "Did you say specifically, Professor? I thought you said—" "Detention." Snape's voice was low now, dangerous. 2 weeks and you'll be scrubbing cauldrons in the dungeons, by hand." But the punishment had only begun. Millicent had clawed off her outer robes and was now flinging slime in every direction in a blind rage. "They think this is funny," she shouted, advancing toward the Gryffindor table, fists clenched, her face a terrifying mask of fury and goo. Pansy Parkinson tried to intervene, shrieking something about pride and Slytherin honor, while Crabbe and Goyle began hurling bread rolls with alarming accuracy. Someone, it might have been Dean Thomas, yelled, "Food fight!" and all hell broke loose. Mashed potatoes soared across the room. Gravy rained from above. The enchanted ceiling began to flicker with lightning in response to the rising aggression. "Brilliant," Fred whispered, dodging a flying drumstick. "We've started a house war. Again. It's not a proper party until Snape threatens to curse us," George replied, laughing as he ducked a flaming pudding. In the midst of the bedlam, Professor McGonagall stormed in, wand raised, shouting over the din, "Enough! Enough! If anyone throws one more sausage, I swear by Merlin's tartan bathrobe." A hush fell, not because of the threat, but because Professor Dumbledore had just appeared at the head of the hall. He didn't say a word. He simply waved his wand once. Instantly, the mess vanished. Slime, food, broken goblets, all gone. Students stood frozen, dripping with guilt and gravy. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled as he surveyed the hall. "Well," he said softly, "that was festive." Snape looked as though he were about to combust. "Albus, these boys—" "I am well aware, Severus." Dumbledore's voice was still gentle. "But perhaps we might allow them to live through the weekend before handing them over to the Hungarian Horntails." The incident went down in Hogwarts history as the Slime War. Rumours spread quickly. Some swore the slime had smelled like roses. Others insisted it had sung when touched. Fred and George refused to confirm or deny either. "It was experimental," Fred said with a shrug. "It was genius," George added. "Even Millicent'll admit that someday." For her part, Millicent never spoke of that evening again, but during potions class the following week, she subtly hexed George's cauldron to explode purple foam into his hair. He accepted it like a true sportsman. "Touché," George had muttered, picking mint-coloured goo from his ear. Years later, when Lee Jordan hosted a special on wizarding pranks for the Wizarding Wireless Network, he asked Fred what his greatest moment at Hogwarts was. Fred grinned and answered without hesitation. "The Slytherin Slime Surprise. Legendary." Number 16, fake fan letters to Harry. It began just after the graveyard, after Cedric's death, after the whispers in the corridors turned into stares and the stares turned into fear, awe, and pity. Harry Potter, the boy who lived again, had returned from the third task of the Triwizard Tournament with a body and a prophecy. The world didn't know what to do with him. Neither did he. At Hogwarts, the mood was thick with unease. The students treated him like a strange object, both heroic and haunting. Even in Gryffindor Tower, where he should have felt safe, laughter died down when he entered. His best friends, Ron and Hermione, tried to act normal, but nothing was normal. He hardly spoke. And when he did, it was clipped, wary, like words cost something he couldn't afford. Then came the letters. At first, they seemed innocent enough, little scrolls of parchment tucked under his pillow tied with ribbons, perfumed and strangely ornate. The first one bore a soft rose scent, and the script was curling and elegant. "Dearest Harry, I don't know how to say this. I've watched you from afar for so long." The letter went on with gushing admiration, flattery, and an almost theatrical tone. It was signed only "Your Secret Enchantress." Harry frowned, turned the paper over in his hands, and thought, surely not. The second letter came 2 days later, tucked into his charms textbook. This one was bolder, more flirtatious, and included a blurry photograph of a girl with long dark hair blowing kisses to the camera. The perfume on this one was overpowering, something floral and cheap, and it clung to Harry's robes all day. "Harry," it read, "I dream about you nearly every night. You are so brave, so strong. I know you face so many trials, and I want to be your light in the darkness. Yours, always, S." He showed it to Hermione, hoping for some rational explanation. She read it with arched eyebrows and pursed lips, then said dryly, "Well, someone's been reading too many romance novels." Ron laughed for half a second before his face fell. "Wait! Someone's actually writing you love letters?" "I don't know who it is," Harry muttered, stuffing the parchment deep into his bag. But he would soon find out. Or rather, the truth would crash into him with all the subtlety of a bludger. The Gryffindor boys' dormitory was the scene of the revelation. Dean and Seamus were snickering about something. Papers strewn across Dean's bed, a half-empty bottle of potion that smelled like lilies and licorice. Fred and George, unusually present for a non-prank reason, stood nearby, trying and failing to look casual. Ron was fiddling with a snitch, his face unreadable. Neville, bless him, was the one who said it out loud. "Harry, there's something you should probably see." He handed Harry a stack of parchment. It was unmistakable. Those same swooping letters, the same purple ink, the same overly dramatic language. "My darling hero, I saw how you faced the Hungarian horntail. Such courage." My heart nearly stopped. "Do you even know the effect you have on girls like me?" Harry felt the floor tilt under him. He flipped through the pages. More letters, more perfume, more blurry, moving photographs of different girls, all oddly similar in style and composition. The pieces began to connect in his head. Too similar, too artificial, too perfectly terrible. And then Fred grinned. "You should have seen your face," he said, nudging George. "We nearly wet ourselves writing the one about the moonlight and your scar." George added, "Although I still say the line about your emerald eyes piercing my soul was a bit much." Harry's ears burned. His jaw tightened. "You wrote these?" he asked, voice low. Fred, still amused, gave a dramatic bow. "We did. You're welcome." "Welcome?" Harry echoed. "For the laugh," George explained. "We figured with all the gloom and doom lately, you could use a bit of romance, even if it's of the imaginary sort." Harry didn't laugh. He stared at the twins, feeling the heat rise in his chest. A joke, a prank, but he felt humiliated, exposed. Those letters had been read aloud. He knew it now, not just seen, read. The line about him wandering the castle shirtless in noble despair, read aloud. "People read them," he said, through gritted teeth. Fred paused, losing a bit of his swagger. "Only a few of us." "Including Seamus, who keeps winking at me in class?" George rubbed the back of his neck. "Okay, maybe we didn't think that part through." "You think?" Harry snapped. Ron stepped in, voice quieter. "They went too far." Fred looked like he wanted to argue, but didn't. George, more perceptive than he let on, tried to offer peace. "It was supposed to be funny. We didn't think you'd take it so personally." Harry stuffed the letters into his bag and left without another word. The next few days were stiff and silent. Harry avoided the common room. He took meals in the Great Hall with his back to the Gryffindor table. Even Quidditch practice was quieter. He flew harder, faster, punishing the air instead of his brothers in mischief. Fred and George tried to apologize, twice. The first time, they cornered him after Transfiguration with a box of fizzing Whizbees and a card that read, "To our favorite tragic hero, don't let heartbreak sour your sense of humor." Harry walked right past them. The second time, they came with no props, no clever lines, just Fred saying, "We were wrong," and George adding, "We're sorry." But Harry barely looked at them. It wasn't just the prank, it was the timing. They had turned something painful into a joke. He already felt isolated, misunderstood. The letters hadn't just embarrassed him, they had mocked the very thing he struggled with most, being seen as more than a headline, more than a story. Hermione finally sat them down. Number 17. Truth Serum Incident with Professor Flitwick. It began with a giggle. Not the kind of giggle that slips out in charms class when someone's wand backfires, but the sort of mischievous, whispering giggle that coils down the hallways like trickster smoke. Fred and George Weasley were at it again. 5th year was dragging on. The owls loomed over the students like storm clouds, and even Peeves seemed subdued. But nothing, absolutely nothing, was duller than History of Magic. Professor Cuthbert Binns, the ghost who didn't seem to know he was dead, had long since traded storytelling for monotone monologues. Most students couldn't stay awake through his lectures. According to legend, Binns had simply floated into class one day after dying in the staff room. No one had questioned it, least of all Binns. "He's a relic," George had whispered to Fred as they leaned against a stone balustrade outside the library, plotting their latest prank. "What he needs is a dose of spice." Fred grinned. "Spice? I'm thinking serum. Imagine. Today, class, I'll confess I was secretly a vampire in the Goblin Rebellions of 1612. George's eyes lit up. Better. We'll give him a reason to talk. Real talk. And so it began. With stealth and skill that only seasoned pranksters possessed, they brewed a tiny batch of serum, illegally of course, and planned to slip it into Professor Binns's inkwell. The logic was flawless in Weasley terms. Binns droned because he didn't care, but if compelled to tell the truth, surely he'd slip into personal anecdotes, scandalous tales, forbidden secrets. They wanted history of magic to become the most exciting subject of the week. Only there was one small flaw. Binns was dead, a ghost, and as any third-year student of magical theory could tell you, potions don't work on ghosts. They didn't know that yet. "Operation Truthquake is a go," Fred whispered in the great hall one morning. He held up a tiny glass vial between two fingers. The liquid inside shimmered like smoke trapped in water. They waited for the perfect moment. Binns always drifted into the staff room an hour before lessons began. He had a habit, if it could be called that, of pausing above his desk to prepare, though no one knew what preparation a ghost required. George had already sneaked in under the guise of fetching parchment for Professor McGonagall. The plan was simple. Swap the ink bottle with one containing a few drops of serum. Only something went wrong. Professor Flitwick, the cheerful, diminutive charms master, had stopped by the staff room earlier that morning. He had been up late grading essays on cheering charms, and the fatigue had left him longing for his usual sweetened mint tea. Spotting a steaming mug on the corner of Binns's desk, he assumed it was communal and helped himself, never realizing the Weasley twins had, in a mix-up, dropped the serum into the very same cup. Fred and George only found out during the lesson. They weren't in Flitwick's class that morning, but they heard about it before the hour was out. Rumours began circulating faster than enchanted galleons in Dumbledore's army. By lunch, everyone knew Professor Flitwick had gone off script. "Did you hear what he said about Professor Sprout?" whispered Katie Bell at the Gryffindor table, eyes wide.
"I heard he started singing," Angelina Johnson said, grinning. "Not just singing," Lee Jordan added, leaning over. "He cried, told the class he'd been in love with her since the Triwizard Tournament." Fred and George exchanged glances. They both paled. "You don't think—" Fred began. "The tea," George whispered. "Oh, Merlin's underpants. We dosed the wrong professor." It was true, and the damage had already been done. In the charms classroom, it had begun like any other lesson. Students had arranged themselves in a semicircle around Professor Flitwick's stacked books. He'd seemed brighter than usual, perhaps even giddy. "Today," he'd announced with a flourish, "we're revisiting the softening charm. But before we do, I must say, I'm absolutely terrified of mice." A few students laughed, assuming it was part of some elaborate example, but then he continued. "Especially grey ones," he said, solemnly. "Once in my quarters, I saw one climb onto my nightstand, and I screamed so loudly that the bloody Baron came to see what had happened." The class was silent. "And I've never told anyone this," Flitwick continued, clutching his chest dramatically. "I used to write poetry about Professor Sprout. I even tried to enchant daffodils to grow into her name. They exploded. I told Dumbledore it was Peeves." By now, the students were either stunned or laughing hysterically. "Sometimes," he whispered, "I wish I had joined the Beauxbatons faculty instead. Their robes are silkier, less itchy." It wasn't until he paused mid-sentence and blinked several times, clearly realizing something was amiss, that the atmosphere shifted. His voice faltered. "What was I saying?" he asked. "Why does my throat taste like licorice?" The silence was deafening. The next day, Flitwick did not show up to breakfast.
Instead, an emergency meeting of the staff was held in Professor McGonagall's office. The Weasley twins, when summoned, attempted their most innocent expressions, but it didn't help. "You two," she said, arms crossed like twin steel bars, "will spend the next fortnight cleaning every cauldron in the dungeons without magic." "But Professor," Fred started. "You administered Veritaserum to a member of the faculty," she snapped. "Even you cannot be so naive as to think that's funny." "But it was meant for Binns," George blurted out. "He's a ghost. It wouldn't have even worked." "Correct, but you failed to ensure it reached him, and instead, a respected professor of this school was publicly humiliated." Her voice grew cold. "You are lucky Professor Flitwick is kind. If this had been Snape, you'd already be expelled." Indeed, Professor Flitwick had shown nothing but grace. The next charms class he taught was quiet. He didn't mention the incident, no one did, but the mood was heavier, as if the delicate trust between teacher and student had been strained. Number 18, Gnome Snot Chews and Public Embarrassment. The first time the unsuspecting Hufflepuff student, Arnold Peasgood, no relation to the ministry official as he often clarified, bit into what he thought was a harmless peppermint sweet, he was standing nervously behind the heavy velvet curtains of the Great Hall's stage. The house banners fluttered faintly above, enchanted by some unseen wind. The ceiling shimmered with the pale light of a cloudy spring morning. It was Arnold's big moment. His speech on inter-house cooperation had taken him weeks to write, and Professor Sprout had even helped him memorize the Latin motto she so dearly loved. And then disaster struck. The sweet began to fizz. Arnold barely had time to register the strange warmth that spread through the back of his throat before his nose exploded into a slow, dripping horror of thick, emerald-green mucus. He stifled a gasp, only to unleash a high-pitched, whistling shriek that cut through the hall like a banshee's wail. Every eye turned toward the curtain. The noise rose again with each breath, wheezy, manic, as if a malfunctioning set of bagpipes had taken up residence in his sinuses. Behind the curtain, Fred and George Weasley crouched, silent and wide-eyed. Their experiment had worked far better than anticipated. Fred whispered, "Did you hear that squeal? I think we hit the perfect frequency, somewhere between a tea kettle and a mandrake." George grinned, trying not to burst into laughter. "You think Flitwick will appreciate it? I think he'll need a silencing charm." Indeed, Flitwick looked stricken, clutching his robes like a maiden in a Gothic novel. Professor McGonagall, whose patience for Fred and George had long worn thin, shot a glance toward the Gryffindor table, but it was too late. Arnold had stepped onto the stage. What followed was both tragic and spectacular. With mucus now cascading down to his chin and the shrill peep accompanying every gasp, Arnold managed only 2 words, "Good morning, Eep," before he froze, eyes wide in panic. The entire hall erupted in laughter, some students falling from their benches. Even Snape's lip twitched. Only Dumbledore remained composed, his fingers steepled thoughtfully under his chin. Later, in the common room, Fred tossed the empty sweet wrapper onto the table. It read, "Weasley's Wizard Wheezes gnome-sized gobstopper of snot and squeal." George raised a toast with his butterbeer. "To the noble art of nasal sabotage." "We should have called them something catchier," Fred said, scratching his chin. "Maybe. Gnome nose nibblers." But the name that stuck, thanks to Lee Jordan's enthusiastic commentary over dinner, was Chewable Gnome Snot. A crude, unforgiving name, but effective. The idea had come to them after a particularly dull herbology class, where George had sneezed during a discussion of Mimblus Mimbletonia. The odd plant had erupted in stink sap. Fred had said, "Imagine if someone sneezed and it made a noise like that." "Better yet," George replied, "imagine if they did it during a speech." And so, in the dead of night, beneath the blankets of their 4-poster beds, the twins began crafting a sweet that could alter a person's breath. Not poison them, oh no, the Weasleys had their line, but a little mucus, a lot of noise. Perfect. The active ingredient had been surprisingly difficult to obtain. They had to beg Jinny to smuggle out a handful of dried gnome whiskers from the Burrow's garden. "Mum thinks I'm mad," Jinny muttered as she handed them over. "If she finds out this is for your next prank—" "She won't," Fred had promised, with the same smile that had never once convinced Mrs. Weasley of anything. The gnome whiskers, when boiled with a touch of doxy saliva and stirred counterclockwise 13 times, produced a thick syrup. The smell alone cleared George's sinuses for a week. "That's the good stuff," he'd said, coughing. They coated ordinary peppermints in the syrup, added a charm to delay the reaction for 5 minutes, and placed one innocent-looking sweet into a shared bowl in the Hufflepuff common room during a Unity visit organized by the professors. Arnold, ever the polite host, had been the first to try it. The aftermath lasted days, the sound didn't fade for hours, and even after Madame Pomfrey purged the effects, Arnold remained holed up in his dormitory. "He's writing a strongly worded letter," someone whispered, to the headmaster. Fred and George received only a mild rebuke from McGonagall, who could barely conceal the twitch in her cheek as she spoke. "This is not the sort of innovation Hogwarts encourages." "Not yet," Fred murmured. "It's still in beta testing," George added helpfully. In truth, Dumbledore had been less upset than amused. "Humour, when used wisely, is a gift," he told them cryptically when they were brought before him. "Just be careful not to waste it on cruelty." That night, Fred sat up in bed. "Do you think we went too far?" George didn't answer immediately. Then, "No, but maybe next time we test it on Lee first." Lee, for his part, was eager. "I'll do it if it gets me out of Bin's class." Word of the prank spread like wildfire. Even students who disliked the Weasleys had to admit it was brilliantly executed. Ravenclaws debated the mechanics, how the charm worked, what caused the squeal. Some even suspected house elf involvement. "Are you insane?" George laughed. "We're not involving house elves, not after that spew debacle." Fred rolled his eyes. "Hermione nearly hexed me when I asked Creature for a toenail sample." "What is wrong with you?" George asked, half laughing. The sweet itself was banned within days. Filch added it to his dangerous objects list right under Peruvian instant darkness powder and above fanged frisbees. But by then, it was too late. The name was legend. Peeves the poltergeist even composed a song, "Know me snot so green and thick, take a lick and make it quick, sniff and squeal, blow and honk, you'll sound just like a broken donk." Years later, in their Diagon Alley shop, the twins framed the wrapper from the original batch. A small plaque beneath it read, "The one that started it all." Arnold Peasgood, surprisingly, visited the shop one summer and bought a box of decoy detonators. "I guess I've forgiven you," he told them. "Sort of." Fred grinned. "We made you famous." "You made me a meme," Arnold replied dryly. Even Ron, who had once groaned over his brother's every new invention, admitted the gnome snot sweets had been a work of genius. "You should have sold those at Hogwarts," he told them during his 6th year. "I'd have slipped one to Malfoy before his potion's owl." They never got the chance to do that, of course. Umbridge had cracked down hard the following year. But in the quiet evenings of Gryffindor Tower, when the fire burned low and laughter echoed off stone walls, the younger students whispered about the day the Great Hall rang with squeals and mucus. It wasn't just a prank, it was a turning point, a sign that Fred and George Weasley weren't just troublemakers, they were inventors, performers, artists of absurdity. In Fred's words, spoken later during one of their many business meetings with Zonko's competitors, "Laughter isn't just fun, it's power. If you can make people laugh at the right time, they'll remember it forever." And they did. Forever. Number 19. Turning Ernie Macmillan into a partial walrus. Ernie Macmillan had always carried himself with a certain pompous dignity, the kind that made him walk with his back a bit too straight, and his prefect badge polished to a mirror's gleam. A proud Hufflepuff with an unwavering sense of honour, he took his role as a student of Hogwarts rather seriously. perhaps too seriously for a school where staircases moved and portraits gossiped. It was on an ordinary morning in late October when Ernie's life was unexpectedly changed, and not by any spell of his own choosing. The great hall had just opened for breakfast, and the early autumn sun glinted through the tall windows, catching the tips of silverware and casting golden patches on the stone floor. The students of Hogwarts were gathering in sleepy clusters, chattering about Quidditch and Charm's homework, unaware of the storm about to erupt at the Hufflepuff table. Fred and George Weasley, notorious for their magical mischief, were already at the Gryffindor table, exchanging mischievous grins and sneaking glances toward the doors. They had been whispering animatedly all morning, their wands twitching in their sleeves, eyes sparkling with the uncontainable thrill of imminent chaos. And then Ernie entered. At first, no one noticed anything wrong. He walked into the hall with his usual self-importance, robes immaculate, tie knotted just so. But as he strode further into the room, heads began to turn. A hush swept over the great hall, quickly replaced by a tidal wave of gasping laughter. Ernie's face, oh Merlin, his face had changed. Two short, gleaming white tusks jutted from his upper jaw, not long enough to drag on the ground, but certainly long enough to make sipping pumpkin juice problematic. His nose was round and swollen, like a rubber bulb, drooping slightly over his lip. And perhaps most hilarious of all, thick bristles of whiskers poked from either side of his cheeks, twitching with every indignant sniff he gave. He looked, unmistakably, like a young walrus attempting to play human. "What on earth?" Ernie murmured, reaching instinctively for his face. His eyes widened, and in an instant he snatched a polished silver plate from the Hufflepuff table and stared into his warped reflection. A moment passed. Then he let out a horrified squeak. The great hall was in chaos. Ravenclaws clutched their sides in silent laughter. Slytherins pointed and whispered cruelly. Even a few Gryffindors fell out of their seats. Somewhere near the teacher's table, Professor Flitwick let out an involuntary hiccup of laughter before quickly covering his mouth. "Who did this?" Ernie shouted, his voice distorted by his newly formed tusks. "This is an absolute violation of the Code of Magical Conduct, an outrage, a scandal." Fred and George were barely holding it together. George leaned into Fred's shoulder, wheezing with laughter. "Oh, come on, Ernie," he gasped. "We just thought you'd look tuskingly charming." "Positively blubbery with importance," Fred added. That did it. Peeves, the poltergeist, who had been lurking near the enchanted ceiling, exploded with glee, singing. Ernie, the walrus, waddled to class, looking quite proud with his blubbery. "Peeves!" barked Professor McGonagall, standing sharply. "Enough!" The laughter began to die down under the stern look from the deputy headmistress, but the damage was already done. Ernie stood frozen, red with humiliation, still gripping the silver plate like a lifeline. "I demand immediate reversal," he sputtered. "I'll go straight to the headmaster." Fred tilted his head innocently. "You might want to use a bigger door." Despite McGonagall's efforts to maintain order, Dumbledore had already stood from his chair. He walked over slowly, his robes trailing like shadows, eyes twinkling. Not with amusement, but with something more thoughtful. "Mr. Macmillan," he said gently, "I believe it is in your best interest to visit Madame Pomfrey. I will also expect Mr. and Mr. Weasley to accompany me to my office afterward." The words hung in the air like a quiet thunderclap. Fred and George exchanged glances, not of fear, but of knowing. Dumbledore rarely summoned students unless there was something to be learned, and his lessons were often far more uncomfortable than detentions. In the hospital wing, Madame Pomfrey tutted and clucked over Ernie's face, muttering about irresponsible transformations and, "What do they think this is, a menagerie?" It took her 3 separate spells and a particularly foul-smelling potion to restore his appearance. But the bruises left on Ernie's pride were far harder to mend. For the next week, he refused to speak to anyone, not even fellow Hufflepuffs. He sat alone in the library, glaring at anyone who dared approach, He even turned down a perfectly decent treacle tart at dinner, a clear sign of inner turmoil. Justin Finch-Fletchley whispered to Hannah Abbott that he'd caught Ernie muttering hexes under his breath, practicing silently with vengeful precision. Dumbledore, for his part, did not take the matter lightly. In his office, amidst the soft ticking of silver instruments and the gentle whir of the pensive, the headmaster looked at the twins with an unreadable expression. "Do you believe magic is a game?" he asked quietly. Fred scratched his neck. "It was just a laugh, sir." George nodded. "No harm meant." "But harm was done," Dumbledore replied. "Even a spell meant in jest can carry the weight of 1,000 humiliations when cast upon an unsuspecting soul." The room fell quiet. "I once said," Dumbledore continued, turning to the window, "that it is our choices, Harry, that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." He turned back to the twins. "Today, you chose laughter over kindness. You chose to take someone's dignity and turn it into a spectacle." Fred and George sobered. "But," he added, "even a Weasley may learn." To their surprise, he assigned no detention, issued no official punishment. Instead, he gave them a parchment scroll and instructed them to spend the next week interviewing other students. Students who had been the butt of jokes, magical or otherwise. "Learn what it feels like to be laughed at," he said. "Then come back and tell me what you've learned." That week changed more than the tone of their jokes. Fred and George interviewed Luna Lovegood, who shared how others mocked her for her beliefs in crumple-horned snorkacs. They spoke with Neville Longbottom, who told them what it felt like to be called a squib behind his back. Even a brief conversation with Moaning Myrtle, who snapped, "At least I don't grow whiskers," gave them pause. By the end of the week, Fred said something he rarely said. "Maybe we went too far." When they returned to Dumbledore, the headmaster nodded and said only, "Then your magic will be stronger for it." The joke, however, lived on in Hogwarts legend. Years later, students would whisper about the day Ernie Macmillan looked like he belonged in the Black Lake with the giant squid. Some claimed he never fully forgave the twins. Others said he secretly laughed about it years later, once his pride had healed and the memory had softened. Some scars, Ernie would later remark in his 7th year, are meant to remind us not of pain, but of the lessons we needed most. But one thing was certain. Fred and George never again used transfiguration on an unsuspecting classmate. Instead, their pranks grew more clever, more consensual, and often more self-deprecating. When they eventually opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, they included a small plaque in their shop behind the counter. Most thought it was just a joke. But if one looked closely, the inscription read, "No tusks without permission," a silent nod to a walrus who had taught them the limits of laughter. And Hogwarts, as always, remembered Number 20, the fake Ministry of Magic letter to Percy. Of all the pranks Fred and George Weasley ever pulled, few left a mark as vivid and hilarious, if slightly cruel, as the time they crafted a fake summons from the Minister of Magic himself. It wasn't just a prank, it was a masterstroke of teenage mischief, woven with mischief magic, and more than a touch of sibling rivalry. The victim, their ever-ambitious, painfully pompous older brother, Percy Ignatius Weasley. It all started during the summer after Percy had begun working for Bartemius Crouch in the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Percy had become almost insufferable. He strutted around the burrow with the air of someone burdened with state secrets, corrected his siblings' grammar, and often looked upon Fred and George as if they were wild animals barely fit for human company. "I am a government official now," he would say, straightening his glasses, as if his desk job was more important than Arthur Weasley's lifetime of service. Fred and George, of course, saw the whole thing as a ripe opportunity. Percy's self-importance was a red rag to their prankster's bull. One evening, as the Weasley family sat around the kitchen table, eating Molly's legendary shepherd's pie, Percy launched into a monologue about the minister's latest speech and his own potential future in the upper echelons of magical policy-making. George had nudged Fred under the table with his foot, and in a moment of unspoken agreement, the idea was born. 2 days later, Percy received an official-looking owl. The ministry's emblem shimmered in gold on the parchment, and the handwriting mimicked the clipped, elegant strokes typical of Cornelius Fudge's correspondence. It read, "Dear Mr. Weasley, you are hereby summoned to an urgent consultation regarding international cauldron standards. The matter is of utmost importance to the stability of magical trade relations. Your insight is deemed crucial. Please report immediately to the Minister's office. CF." The moment Percy read it, he sprang from his seat. "The Minister needs me," he announced, ignoring the raised eyebrows of Bill and Charlie. He buttoned his robes with shaking fingers, muttering something about diplomatic chaos and brewery taxes. Molly looked concerned, Arthur intrigued. Fred and George merely blinked innocently. He disapparated from the garden with a loud crack, mid-bite of treacle tart, and the entire table went silent. Jinny's fork paused mid-air. Ron whispered, "Did he really just go?" And then the twins could no longer contain it. They burst into fits of laughter, clutching their sides. "I can't believe he fell for it," Fred wheezed. "It was the cauldron standards that did it," George added. "The bloke's obsessed with them." Meanwhile, Percy arrived at the ministry, hair wind-blown and cheeks flushed. He stormed through the atrium with purpose, nodding curtly to the night watch wizard, and made his way to the minister's office, only to find the doors tightly shut and locked. No lanterns burned inside. The corridor was empty, silent. There, stuck to the heavy oak door with a permanent sticking charm, was a second piece of parchment. The same ministry seal, the same handwriting. "Too late, Mr. Genius." Percy stared at the note for several seconds. His ears turned a deep, furious red. He looked around, certain he was being watched, but the silence mocked him. He had just raced across half of England like a loyal hound chasing a thrown stick, only to find it was never tossed. His rage knew no bounds. When he returned to the burrow an hour later, the family had resumed dessert. Percy slammed the door behind him with such force that a portrait fell off the wall. His voice thundered through the house. "Fred! George!" Molly Weasley nearly dropped the kettle. "Percy, what? Don't you Percy me!" he shouted, waving the parchment in the air like a bloody banner. "This is not funny. This is a mockery of my position, a mockery of the Minister of Magic." Arthur tried to reason with him. "Percy, now I'm sure they didn't mean—" But Percy wasn't listening. "Do you understand how this reflects on me? Had anyone seen me there? Had anyone even thought to question the legitimacy?" Upstairs, Fred and George had barricaded their door with an armoire. "Do you think he's mad?" George whispered. Fred pressed his ear to the wood. "No, I think he's incandescent." Later, Ron would recall the event as the night Percy's head almost exploded. Jinny said she had never seen her mother speechless until then. Even Charlie, who rarely laughed aloud, had to excuse himself into the backyard, where he could be heard snorting behind the broom shed. Eventually, Molly made her way upstairs and knocked firmly. "Boys," she said, voice dangerously calm, "come out, now!" There was a long silence, then the sound of a chair scraping, a deep breath, and the door creaked open. Fred stepped out first, grinning sheepishly. "He wasn't actually fired, was he?" "No thanks to you," Molly snapped. "You're lucky he didn't hex you." To Percy, the prank had crossed a line. He didn't speak to them for a week and refused to sit at the same table. "I am a civil servant," he declared. "I will not be treated like a punchline." He locked himself in his room and pored over ministry reports, stewing in righteous indignation. Fred and George, for all their cheek, didn't gloat, at least not much. "It was supposed to be a laugh," George said one morning to Ron. "Honestly, we thought he'd see through it by the word cauldron." But Percy, who took pride in his correspondence with officials and dreamed of rising through the bureaucratic ranks, took it as a personal betrayal. He didn't laugh, he didn't forgive. He started spending more time at work than at home, the distance between him and his family growing with each new promotion. "Percy's always been a bit of a tight wand," Fred said, "but we didn't think he'd turn into this." Years later, during the Second Wizarding War, when Percy stood beside Kingsley Shacklebolt at the Battle of Hogwarts, wands drawn against the Death Eaters, Fred would glance at him and grin. "Look at that," he had said. "Percy fighting the good fight. Maybe we did knock some sense into him after all." But the memory of that fake ministry letter stayed in Percy's mind. It was a scar of pride, wounded and dignity bruised, and yet buried deep beneath that scar was the truth he never admitted. For just a moment, when he read the letter, he'd felt important. He'd felt seen. Fred, for his part, never apologized directly. He needed a wake-up call, he once told Harry. We all do sometimes. Even J.K. Rowling in interviews hinted that Fred and George's pranksterism often held deeper meaning. They weren't merely jesters, they were truth-tellers in disguise, jesters who pointed out hypocrisy with a joke and deflated egos with a single charm. In the end, the prank became a family legend, one of many. "Remember the time Percy raced to the ministry over a fake letter?" Ron would laugh years later at Christmas gatherings. Even Percy, older, greyer, with a ministerial sash across his chest, would crack a reluctant smile. "Yes," he would say, "and you all ate my treacle tart." And somewhere, if you listen closely, you can almost hear Fred's laughter echoing in the halls of the burrow, mingling with the crackle of the fire and the clink of butterbeer bottles. Because no matter how far the Weasleys went, no matter how serious the world became, that one joke reminded them. Nothing was more sacred than family, even when it meant making a fool of your brother, especially then. Number 21, Screaming Enchanted Buttons. The winter wind howled through the stone corridors of Hogwarts that morning, carrying with it the faint scent of pumpkin pasties and the ever-present hum of mischief brewing somewhere in its ancient walls. It was the week after Christmas break, and the castle, though dusted with snow and wrapped in enchanted icicles, was far from peaceful. That was especially true in the Gryffindor common room, where Fred and George Weasley sat hunched over a velvet box filled with brass fittings, dragonhide thread, and a tiny collection of enchanted trinkets. They were working on something they called attachable spells, a new Weasley's Wizard Wheezes concept involving portable enchantments that could be affixed to clothing, objects, or even, in theory, other people. The target for their first public test? Neville Longbottom. Neville had a habit of arriving late to breakfast, always breathless, usually with a sock askew and a plant tucked under his arm. He was kind-hearted, often nervous, and unfortunately for him, a magnet for the twins' more experimental inventions. That morning, as Neville hung his winter cloak beside the fireplace, Fred murmured something under his breath, fingers flicking a wand tip along the hem. George followed suit, tracing the collar. It looked innocent enough, two brothers helping a friend shake off the cold. In truth, they had just affixed 6 experimental sound loop charms to the brass buttons on Neville's school robe. The first incident happened in herbology, where Neville always felt at ease among the fanged geraniums and fluttering leaves, as he leaned forward to inspect a pufferpod, his elbow pressed against his middle button. From it burst a loud hroink, the unmistakable sound of a pig snorting mid-snore. The entire class froze. Professor Sprout, covered in compost, blinked in confusion. Neville turned beet red and muttered an apology, unaware of what he had done. Later that day, during lunch in the Great Hall, another button sounded off. This time it gave a high-pitched, bubbling gurgle, like someone gargling soup through a trumpet. Ron spat out his pumpkin juice. "What was that?" he asked, through laughter. Neville had no answer. The buttons had no visual sign of enchantment. Fred and George had made sure of it. The magic lay dormant until pressed, activated by a simple physical nudge. The effect was instantaneous and for Fred and George utterly delightful. By the time the 4th button had erupted into the sound of a banshee's wail, Neville was spiraling into confusion. "Maybe it's Peeves," he murmured nervously to Seamus Finnegan as they crossed the courtyard. "Or maybe my robe's cursed." Peeves, for once, wasn't involved. The poltergeist found the affair amusing enough to let it unfold on its own. "Let the buttons sing," he chirped once. "Hogwarts needs a bit of opera." But things truly escalated during defense against the dark arts. The class had been unusually tense ever since Professor Umbridge had returned from a brief meeting with the minister. She wore her usual pink cardigan, her tight-lipped frown slightly tighter than normal. The lesson was on respecting magical authority, a topic which even the books found dry. Students doodled on parchments or stared longingly at the clock, waiting for freedom. Then, without warning, Neville shifted in his seat. A button near his chest compressed between the edge of the desk and his torso. "Silence, Mr. Longbottom!" The voice boomed through the classroom, sharp, shrill, unmistakable. It was Umbridge's own voice, duplicated down to the breathy menace that curled around her consonants. The classroom erupted, not with fear, but with laughter. Dean Thomas dropped his quill. Parvati Patil had to cover her face with a textbook. Even Hermione choked back a giggle. The only one not amused was Umbridge herself. Her eyes narrowed to slits behind her spectacles. "Who said that?" she hissed. "Who dares mock this office?" Neville sat frozen. I didn't mean to," but before he could finish, another button activated with a delayed echo. "Sit up straight, boy!" it screamed, again in Umbridge's clipped tones. She turned the colour of a poisoned peach. What followed was a lesson in humiliation, not for Neville, but for the supposed authority in the room. As she marched toward his desk, ready to assign detentions, yet another button went off. This one didn't speak. It detonated, a loud boom like a firework being set off in a tunnel. Dust fell from the ceiling. The windows rattled. Neville looked as if he might faint. The twins, watching from the back row, couldn't contain themselves. Fred pressed a hand over his mouth, trembling with suppressed laughter. George scribbled notes furiously on a crumpled bit of parchment. Version 2. Include delay timer. Very effective. Umbridge was not so amused. She ordered Filch to confiscate the robe and sent Neville to Professor McGonagall for disciplinary review. The robe was examined, dissected, and eventually returned, but the buttons had been removed manually with tweezers and spellbreak charms. McGonagall, while stern, had a faint twitch in her mouth when Neville explained what had happened. "Mr. Longbottom," she said dryly, "next time you feel the need to broadcast orders in my classroom, please use your own voice." After that day, Neville refused to wear any robe that had been stitched or sewn without his direct supervision. "Magical seams," he muttered to himself more than once. "They're watching me." He took to fastening his school cloak with a single brass clasp, no buttons. His classmates started calling him One-Clip Nev. The name stuck longer than anyone expected. Fred and George, for their part, considered the prank a grand success. "We made a soundboard," Fred told Lee Jordan, "out of fashion accessories." George added, "The possibilities are endless. Imagine if we installed it into Slytherin's socks, every step. Mudblood. Filthy blood traitor." They'd drive themselves mad. Their idea wasn't new in theory. The Hogwarts library housed references to similar magic in dusty corners of the restricted section. One book, Enchanted Accessories, a history of wearable wizardry, detailed 14th century noblemen who had hats that shouted insults at rivals. Another told of cursed gloves in the 1700s that whispered secrets every time they were clenched. But Fred and George had refined the concept for fun and chaos. "I think the key was personalization," George said once, reflecting on the moment. "We didn't just enchant the button to scream, we made it sound like Umbridge. It's that little detail, specificity, that turns a prank into art." There was, however, an unintended side effect. The voice sample had been taken using a clever charm they invented called Echo Vox. It captured the tone and pitch of a subject's voice for replay later, but the spell had a habit of lingering. Weeks later, when George pulled a dusty cloak from his locker, it muttered, "You will write, I must not tell lies," before falling silent. The charm was echoing stored emotional energy. It had imprinted more deeply than expected. That frightened even the twins. Eventually, they archived the magical buttons in a vault beneath their future shop, noting them as prototype, Class 3, unstable, hilarious, but risky. They did not reattempt the experiment for several months. Neville, meanwhile, became something of a legend. "The boy who wore screaming buttons," they called him. First years asked him if the cloak still worked. Ravenclaws tried to duplicate the spell and failed. Even Luna Lovegood asked him once if he could teach her to make her jewelry whisper poetry. "Only if it doesn't shout," Neville said, still wincing. Years later, when Fred and George opened their shop in Diagon Alley, they launched a tamer version of the prank, magical chuckle cuffs. Bracelets that giggled or groaned, depending on the mood of the wearer. But they never again used voice replication. "Too real," Fred said. "Too close to actual curses." Though not mentioned in detail in any official Hogwarts text, the story of Neville's enchanted buttons passed through the halls like ghostlight. Students remembered it not just for the humour, but for the surrealism of watching authority fall to embarrassment. It was a perfect snapshot of Hogwarts itself, where magic, rebellion, and laughter often collided in strange, unforgettable ways. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Umbridge's presence dominates much of the student experience. Her attempts to suppress, control, and silence were constant, but even Rowling writes she gave the impression that she would have liked nothing better than to be rid of them all. In that light, the prank took on deeper meaning. It wasn't just a joke, it was resistance, however accidental on Neville's part. And perhaps that's what made it last. Not the sound of the buttons, not even the image of Neville blushing while being barked at by his own cloak, but the idea that even the meekest Gryffindor, through no fault or design of his own, could become a symbol of defiance. Through buttons, through laughter, through sheer accidental magic. Number 22, the stair trap for Dean Thomas. It was the final evening before classes resumed at Hogwarts, and the Gryffindor common room was unusually chaotic. Students were returning from the winter holidays, some dragging trunks, others chattering about their vacation adventures. Amid the noise and bustle, Dean Thomas appeared at the entrance to the tower, his arms tightly wrapped around a comically large suitcase, a deep maroon trunk that wheezed with every bump. His holiday had been long, his mother had packed far too much, and now he was left with the exhausting task of hauling his life back up to the boys' dormitory. The staircase that wound its way through Gryffindor Tower was familiar to all its inhabitants, but not today. Fred and George Weasley, always hungry for a laugh, had been left unattended for too long. Earlier that day, using a modified version of a repelling jinx combined with a bit of creative charm work, they had enchanted the stairwell so that every 10th step would quietly vanish beneath the feet of the climber, sending them backward to the ground floor. It was subtle, effective, and, as they claimed, an experiment in patience and balance. Fred had grinned as they applied the enchantment. "Let's see who notices first," he'd said to George, who had already conjured a floating armchair and parked himself near the top landing. They didn't expect anything dramatic, maybe a few confused first years or a prefect with a bruised ego. What they hadn't predicted was Dean Thomas, wide-eyed and sweating, entering the building with the physical baggage of a small hippogriff. Dean's first attempt seemed promising. He counted his steps out loud under his breath, not realizing that the 10th step was primed to betray him. When it did, the stair vanished and his foot fell into empty space. He tumbled backward with a shout, landing hard on his back as the trunk bounced down beside him. The latch snapped open, and a tangle of socks, books, and sketchpads exploded into the air. A Gryffindor scarf drifted gently down and landed on his nose. Above him, Fred nudged George. That was better than I imagined. Dean, ever the patient one, collected his things without a word. He re-secured the trunk, adjusted the strap over his shoulder, and began the ascent once more. 10 steps later, the trap activated again. This time he nearly twisted an ankle. A few younger students offered to help, but Dean, flushed with embarrassment, waved them away. "No, it's fine. Just a bad step." Over the next half hour, the same pattern repeated like a cursed melody. Up 10 steps, fall, collect, try again. By the 5th cycle, Dean had taken to muttering under his breath in frustration. "All right, he whispered to no one. "This is personal." He even attempted to skip steps, thinking he could outsmart the magic by altering his pace, but Fred and George had thought of that too. The charm calculated the climber's stride, not just the number. Other Gryffindors began to notice. Some laughed, some looked concerned. Parvati Patil leaned over the banister with a frown, watching her friend disappear downward once again. "Dean, are you okay?" she called. Dean didn't answer. He was bent over, hands on his knees, face red, soaked in sweat. His arms were beginning to tremble from lifting the trunk so many times. It wasn't just heavy, it was enchanted, expanded inside to fit extra things. Fred had seen him struggle before, but never like this. Eventually Dean gave up. He sat at the foot of the stairs in defeat, the trunk beside him, its hinges groaning in protest. He began to remove items one by one, a thick green jumper knitted by his mum, a sketch pad filled with pages of football players and Hogwarts classmates, a stack of chocolate frog cards tied with string. Each item was carried separately up the stairs, carefully counted and timed to avoid the rogue steps. It took nearly 45 minutes before he was finished. By the time Dean placed the last book, a Muggle history volume about World War II, onto his bed, he looked like he'd run a marathon. The twins, however, were delighted. George clapped his hands softly and whispered, "Art, pure art." Their amusement, however, was short-lived. Professor McGonagall had been searching for Dean to deliver a letter from home. As she climbed the Gryffindor Tower staircase, she noticed a strange shimmer on the 9th step and paused. Her wand twitched in her hand. "Mischief," she muttered, narrowing her eyes. She stepped lightly around the enchanted steps, testing them as she went. Upon reaching the common room, she found Fred and George trying to look innocent in a corner, and Dean collapsed in an armchair, his socks damp with sweat. "Mr. Thomas," she said sternly, "you've been here for quite some time." Dean nodded, too tired to reply. "Would you care to explain why I saw you fall off the stairs 5 times? Before Dean could answer, Fred stepped forward with a sheepish smile. "Just a bit of harmless fun, Professor." "Fun?" she echoed. "You call sabotaging a staircase fun?" Fred shrugged. "In a manner of speaking." McGonagall's lips pressed into a thin line. "You may consider your wands confiscated until tomorrow evening, and if I hear of so much as a floating ink pot in this tower tonight, you'll be cleaning every classroom in this castle by hand." The twins accepted the punishment with unexpected grace. Fred leaned toward Dean as McGonagall walked away. "You were magnificent," he whispered. "Theatrics, drama, tragedy. You've got a gift." Dean didn't smile. That night, the stairs returned to normal. The spell lifted, and the tower seemed to exhale. But the legend of the enchanted staircase spread quickly. Some said Dean had triggered the trap on purpose to impress Parvati. Others claimed it had been a secret Weasley test of character. A few even believed it was a new form of Gryffindor hazing, a rite of passage disguised as a prank. Years later, the tale of Dean Thomas and the looping staircase remained a favourite story in the Gryffindor dorms. New first years would hear it from 7th years with exaggerated details. Dean battling the stairs like a knight versus a dragon, each sock a flag of resistance, each book a weapon in his struggle. Even Neville Longbottom once told it at a reunion, describing Dean's sweat-soaked face and the soft applause from Fred as if recounting a battle scene from Hogwarts. A history. The moment had passed, the bruises had healed, but the memory lingered in the stone of the tower. Fred and George, for their part, were not remorseful. They viewed the incident as a minor masterpiece, an experiment in humour and human behaviour. "We made magic practical," George had said during one of their later detentions. "It wasn't just about the spell, it was about the performance. Dean made it art." McGonagall, however, never forgot. While she softened toward the twins in later years, she kept a private note in her desk drawer that read, "Never underestimate a Weasley with time on his hands." As for Dean, he developed a habit after that. He always tapped the 10th step of every staircase before putting his weight on it. A quiet, invisible check. He never blamed Fred and George, not really. He even smiled once when someone brought it up. "It taught me patience," he admitted, "and how to carry a trunk one item at a time." The Hogwarts staircases were known to move of their own accord, shifting mid-step, rearranging themselves without warning. But that day they had become something else, tools of comedy, of chaos, and of quiet endurance. The magic wasn't in the spell, it was in the way the story lived on even after the enchantment faded, and in the end perhaps Fred and George were right. Magic wasn't just about wands and charms. Sometimes it was about the unexpected joy of watching someone rise over and over, no matter how many times they fell. Number 23, soapy flood in the toilets. Of all the chaos that Fred and George Weasley ever unleashed upon the ancient halls of Hogwarts, the incident now remembered as the foam flood ranks among the most legendary. Not because it was their most destructive prank, though it came close, but because of the impeccable, or perhaps appallingly unfortunate, timing. It happened during the late spring of their 6th year, when the days were growing warmer, the castle air was heavy with the scent of blooming heather, and the students were dreaming more of the Black Lake than of homework. And yet, amidst this golden lull before exams, the Weasley twins decided it was time to test a brand new invention, the clogging powder. They had developed it in secret, tucked away in a forgotten cupboard near the divination tower. Their goal, according to one of Fred's scribbled notes found later, was to create a lavatory experience so dramatically unforgettable it would enter Hogwarts folklore forever. Clogging powder was their latest concoction for their burgeoning line of magical mischief goods. When sprinkled down any drain, it would react with water to produce an immense volume of dense, sweet-smelling foam that filled pipes, overflowed basins, and, in sufficient quantities, could turn an entire corridor into a bubble bath. The twins chose their moment with mischievous precision, or so they thought. Just before lunch, when most of the students would be crowding the Great Hall and the toilets would be temporarily deserted, they crept into the 4th-floor boys' lavatory in the eastern wing. Fred emptied an entire pouch of the glittering silver powder into one of the sinks, while George readied the second dose for the toilet bowl. They exchanged gleeful nods, then flushed. What they hadn't known, and what in hindsight they admitted they absolutely should have checked, was that this very same day had been marked for an unannounced inspection by the Department of Magical Education. 2 ministry officials, Mr. Bartleby Crispin and Madam Eugenia Thistlewick, had arrived earlier that morning, escorted discreetly through the castle by Professor McGonagall, who, perhaps sensing trouble, had already spent the entire morning with her lips pursed so tightly they nearly disappeared. As the powder surged through the old plumbing of the castle, the effects were immediate and shocking. The foam, peach-scented and unnaturally glossy, began gurgling up not just from the sinks and toilets where the powder was deposited, but also unpredictably from every connected water outlet in the corridor. Faucets exploded in lathery geysers. Shower drains became foam fountains. Within 5 minutes, the eastern corridor of the 4th floor was waist-deep in bubbles. The portraits on the walls howled in protest as foam crept into their frames, obscuring the views of armoured knights and pastoral landscapes. At that precise moment, Mr. Crispin and Madam Thistlewick, with their clipboards and stern expressions, turned the corner. Bartleby, always leading with his cane and a booming cough, was the first to step into the flood. His polished black shoes vanished beneath the foam in seconds, followed by his trousers. Madam Thistlewick, with her ever-present monocle, managed a strangled gasp before a rogue wave of soap surged from a side drain and hit her full in the face. The monocle was never seen again. "I dare say this school exhibits a certain laxity in maintenance," Crispin was later overheard muttering to his drenched companion as they sloshed back toward the staircase, their robes clinging to them like wet parchment. Back in the great hall, the mood was one of nervous expectancy. Whispers had begun circulating almost instantly. Something's happened in the East Wing. There's foam, actual foam. It's the ghosts. They've exploded. When Dumbledore himself finally entered the hall, his silver beard damp and curling at the ends, silence fell. Never in living memory had the headmaster appeared anything less than composed. But that day he was not smiling. "Peeves is dancing in the bubbles," Professor Flitwick informed him helpfully, arriving with a dripping shoe in hand. "He's turned the whole thing into a party." And indeed, Peeves the poltergeist had wasted no time in making the most of the situation. He had donned a snorkel and was swimming laps through the foam, pelting students with improvised soap bombs and singing, "Scrubby-dubby foam, who left the castle home alone?" Fred and George were summoned immediately. Not by Professor McGonagall, though she stood by with a face like thunder, but by Dumbledore himself. They marched into his office still damp around the ankles and smelling vaguely of apricots. For a long moment he simply looked at them, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes twinkling, but only faintly. "It would seem," he said finally, "that our plumbing is now quite festive." The twins, to their credit, did not attempt to deny it. Fred offered a hesitant smile, while George looked more interested in whether the foam might have reached the dungeons yet. Dumbledore sighed. It was not the sigh of anger, but of deep and resigned understanding. He had, after all, known these boys since they were 11. He knew precisely the kind of mischief they were capable of. What he had perhaps underestimated was their ambition. What truly saved them from expulsion, or at least a month of detention, was not remorse or excuses. It was the fact that the foam, in the end, caused no real harm. The inspectors, though outraged, were unharmed. The floors dried quickly thanks to a spell by Professor Sprout, who claimed it was no worse than one of Neville's potions mishaps. Even Filch, normally apoplectic about any disturbance, admitted, privately, that the corridors smelled a damn sight better than usual. That night, as the castle returned to normal, and the last of the foam was vanishing beneath the careful swishes of enchanted mops, whispers of admiration began to spread. "Did you see the way the foam rose up like a wave? It came out of the toilets, all of them. Even Myrtle was laughing." The Weasley twins became, for a brief time, legendary even among the prankster elite of Hogwarts. Lee Jordan insisted they should bottle the foam and sell it. "You could revolutionize bathing," he declared. But Fred and George had already moved on, murmuring about something they called skiving snack boxes. Clogging powder was shelved, a one-time event etched into Hogwarts history, not because of its brilliance, but because of its timing. Years later, when recounting the incident to an amused Jinny or a disbelieving Ron, George would always insist on one thing. The look on Madame Thistlewick's face as the foam hit her monocle was worth the month of cleaning duty they eventually received. "She looked," he claimed, "like a startled puffskein caught in a shampoo bottle." Interestingly, the prank did make it into one official ministry document, though heavily censored. A report titled "Unusual Magical Occurrences in Educational Environments" refers vaguely to a magical plumbing incident involving cosmetic charms and corridor saturation. Dumbledore, when asked for clarification, simply replied, "It was an eventful day filled with unexpected cleanliness." No one ever confessed exactly how much clogging powder had been used, or whether the foam had reached the Ravenclaw Tower's lower bathrooms. Some claimed that even weeks later, bubbles still occasionally popped out of the sink in moaning Myrtle's bathroom. Myrtle herself referred to it as the happiest day I've had in centuries, though she added with a sniff, until they tried to flush a dung bomb the next week. Fred and George, in their final year, would go on to commit even more astonishing acts of defiance and hilarity, but to the younger students the foam flood remained the crown jewel. It had flair, it had timing, and most importantly, it had left the ministry flustered and dripping. As for Dumbledore, he never mentioned the incident again, but those who knew him best swore that for weeks afterward his beard carried a faint scent of apricots, a subtle, sweet-smelling reminder that even in a school of magic, the unexpected always had a way of bubbling to the surface. Number 24, partially invisible candy prank. The morning had started as any other. A dull drizzle spattered the enchanted windows of the Hogwarts Great Hall. Students murmured groggily over their toast, and Professor McGonagall was already darting sharp glances down the Gryffindor table. But beneath that ordinary haze of student life brewed the chaos that only Fred and George Weasley could summon. It began with a lollipop. It wasn't marked nor wrapped in anything unusual, just a small swirl of lavender and grey sugar on a thin white stick, innocent in appearance, tucked carefully into the folds of a napkin beside the pumpkin juice. Its intended recipient, Lavender Brown, had been too distracted by her own reflection in the polished spoon to notice the mischievous twinkle in Fred's eyes as he accidentally knocked the napkin closer to her. She picked it up without a second thought. Why shouldn't she? It looked sweet, and Lavender always had a fondness for anything sugary and delicate. By the time the bell rang for Transfiguration, the lollipop was gone, and Lavender was skipping up the marble staircase, humming to herself, blissfully unaware that she was about to become a living ghost. The first signs were subtle. As the students settled into their seats and Professor McGonagall began her sharp, precise instructions on human-to-object transfiguration, a hush fell over the room. Lavender, seated beside Parvati Patil, had raised her hand to fix her hair, and the class gasped. Her hand, once clutching a comb, was no longer visible. Only the comb floated, eerily suspended in the air like something out of Hogwarts, a history of hauntings. She did not notice at first, but as Parvati screamed and stumbled backward, and Lavender looked down at her lap, realization struck like a thunderclap. Her arms, both of them, were gone. Not blood, not injury, simply vanished. What remained of her sleeves hung limp, as if filled with air, with flashes of invisible flesh flickering between seams of light. Students shrieked. Some scrambled toward the doors, others stared, paralyzed with confusion and fear. Lavender herself stood up too quickly, knocking over her chair, her face a patchwork of fading features, nose translucent, lips partially missing, eyes flickering like candle flames behind a veil. To her it felt like being unraveled. She clutched at her stomach, only to find nothing but the cold pressure of empty air where her hands should be. Her shriek tore through the classroom, echoing down the corridors. "I'm cursed! Someone help me!" And in the far corner of the room, behind a pile of Transfiguration textbooks, Fred and George Weasley tried not to burst out laughing. Their quills danced feverishly across a scroll titled Experiment, Shug 17, Phase Response to Muggle-inspired cloaking confectionery. Fred nudged George with his elbow, eyes gleaming. "Right on schedule," he scribbled in the margin. They had worked on the prototype for weeks. Nights spent hunched over bubbling cauldrons and charts, their dormitory filled with the scent of burnt sugar and ink. Inspired by disillusionment charms and enhanced with traces of chameleon ghoul essence, the lollipops, cheekily named Peepo Vanish, were never meant to be sold. Not yet. They were in what Fred called the deliciously dangerous testing phase. Lavender Brown, of course, had never signed up to be their test subject, but the twins had grown comfortable skirting ethical boundaries when it came to their inventions. "Progress demands a few dramatic demonstrations," George had said the night before, wrapping the prototype, "and she does eat anything with glitter." Professor McGonagall had never lost her composure so completely in all her years at Hogwarts. Her wand flew from her robe in a blur, casting spell after spell, none of which had any effect. Lavender's body kept flickering between visible and invisible like a candle snuffed out and lit again in rapid succession. Her robes flapped wildly as she collapsed in a fit of tears, whispering hysterically about death curses and vanishing sicknesses. "Someone's cursed me," she sobbed. "Someone wants me gone." It was Hermione Granger who finally stormed across the room and snatched the scroll from Fred's desk. Her eyes flew across the page, widening with each line. "You gave her this?" she snapped. "You fed her this thing without telling her? What if she had gone completely invisible? What if she had fainted and no one could find her?" Fred shrugged. "Then we'd have found her by the noise. She's not exactly quiet." But George's expression had already shifted from smug to sheepish. "We didn't think it'd last more than 2 minutes," he muttered. "We wanted to see the patchwork effect." "It's called informed consent," Hermione said, through gritted teeth. "You don't just experiment on people." Even Ron had looked uncomfortable. Harry stared at Lavender, who now clung to Parvati like a wet rag, her face slowly returning to full visibility, pale and stained with mascara. He couldn't help remembering the words Fred had once proudly proclaimed. "Why spend 7 years learning spells when you can chew your way to a disillusionment charm?" What followed was an emergency meeting in the headmaster's office, where Dumbledore listened quietly, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Hermione demanded punishment. McGonagall, still pale from the incident, insisted on immediate confiscation of all experimental Weasleys, Wizard Wheezes prototypes. Dumbledore, ever enigmatic, merely said, "Invisibility has long been one of mankind's most dangerous fantasies, but when achieved without understanding, it becomes a nightmare." He gave the twins a week's detention and banned all unapproved suites in the castle, a ban they would continue to break with alarming creativity. Back in Gryffindor Tower, Lavender refused to speak to anyone for days. She claimed her dreams were haunted by visions of floating eyeballs and vanishing hands. Some said she even visited Madame Pomfrey twice more, convinced that her toes were fading again. Fred, however, was ecstatic. The visibility decay timeline was almost perfect, he declared. And the randomness of it, arms first, then jawline, it's practically art. George grinned. "We just need to stabilize the dissolution rate and maybe add a cherry flavor." They were already working on version 2.0. Hermione, for her part, launched a petition among the prefects demanding a review board for all magical inventions brought into Hogwarts. "This isn't a joke," she said, slamming her book on the table in the library. "What if it had been someone with a heart condition? What if Lavender had fainted on the staircase? This kind of magic, untested, unstable, it's reckless." But not everyone agreed. Lee Jordan said the prank was legendary. Seamus Finnegan tried to buy 2 lollipops off Fred the next day. Even Professor Flitwick, when he heard about it, was said to have chuckled under his breath. "Reminds me of a charm I once botched in my youth," he muttered. In the end, it wasn't the danger or the outrage that gave the prank its place in Hogwarts history. It was the image of Lavender Brown, half visible, sobbing in the center of the classroom while her lips faded in and out of existence. It was the way fear twisted through the air like smoke, then melted into laughter when her form slowly returned. It was the way the prank skirted the edge between terror and hilarity, exactly where Fred and George always lived. "We didn't mean to scare her that badly," George later said during detention, scrubbing cauldrons with a grumbling filch breathing down their necks. "We just thought it'd be funny if she vanished during class." "And it was," Fred added. "Admit it," even McGonagall's monocle twitched. It became one of those stories retold year after year, always beginning with the same line. "Did you ever hear about the time Lavender turned invisible?" First years whispered it with awe, imagining limbs melting into air. Seventh years recounted it with fondness, shaking their heads at the chaos of youth. Fred and George, of course, never stopped inventing. Their next product was a nosebleed nougat that triggered a brief but violent sneeze of blue smoke. But they always remembered Peepo Vanish with pride. It marked a turning point, not just in their experiments, but in their legend. They weren't just pranksters anymore. They were creators of magic the world had never seen. Years later, in their Diagon Alley shop, one could find a locked glass case labeled "Banned at Hogwarts, do not consume without escape plan." Inside were 3 lollipops swirled with lavender and grey, and a handwritten sign dedicated to LB, who taught us that fear and laughter are sometimes the same spell. The moral of the story was never written in a textbook, but it lived in whispers down Hogwarts corridors. Magic is powerful, unpredictable, and sometimes invisible. And in the hands of Fred and George Weasley, it was also wonderfully, terribly, unforgettably fun. Number 25, the Snoring Goose Pillow Curse. There are pranks that fade with time and those that leave behind something far more lasting, a whisper in the halls, a half-suppressed chuckle, or even, in rare cases, a scar. The tale of Sam Turpie and the Snoring Curse is one of those rare cases. Set within the creaking, enchanted walls of Ravenclaw Tower, it's a story often retold with a touch of discomfort and a glance toward the ceiling, as if fearing echoes of a boy who once declared himself, quite involuntarily, to be a magical goose. Fred and George Weasley, known throughout Hogwarts for their bottomless capacity for mischief, were in their 4th year when they turned their gaze to Sam Turpie, a second-year Ravenclaw whose presence was so quiet it could be mistaken for absence. Sam was the sort of boy whose books never had bent spines, whose ink never smudged, and whose footsteps barely whispered on the stone floors. He had no talent for loud conversation, nor did he seek the company of others. That, in itself, was enough to draw the twins' attention. Fred first noticed him during a shared astronomy class. Sam had set up his telescope with meticulous care and had declined every attempt at small talk. "You'd think he was studying stars to live among them," Fred whispered to George later that night. The comment had made them both laugh, quietly at first, then louder, feeding off each other's energy as always, but the seed of mischief was planted. One evening, after overhearing a few boys in Ravenclaw comment on how Sam snored in his sleep, the twins devised a plan. It was, by their standards, rather tame. The enchantment was subtle, elegant even, cast not upon Sam himself, but upon his pillow. Whenever Sam snored, the spell would trigger and project his voice, albeit distorted, shouting absurdities into the night. They chose one line in particular. "I'm a magical goose, I fly in my dreams," words that would bounce off the domed ceiling of the Ravenclaw dormitory like an incantation gone mad. The first night, the reaction was exactly as the twins hoped. The entire room woke in confusion as Sam's voice bellowed through the darkness, high-pitched and frenzied. A lamp fell, someone screamed, then came the laughter. Ravenclaws weren't known for cruel pranks, but they were quick-witted and unforgiving in their humor. By morning, Sam's face was a shade of parchment and his hands trembled as he tried to pour pumpkin juice in the great hall. No one said it directly to him, but someone had already drawn a sketch of a goose wearing glasses and left it on his seat. The spell persisted for several nights. Each time Sam snored, the room erupted with proclamations of aerial poultry. He began to dread sleep, fearing the laughter that came after the noise. Some mornings he was already awake, sitting up in bed with dark circles under his eyes. He stopped answering questions in class. He grew silent even during his private tutoring sessions with Professor Flitwick, who eventually asked, "Sam, is something troubling you?" But Sam, as always, said nothing. He was not a boy who complained, he was a boy who endured. It was only when one of the prefects, Eleanor Moonbright, a clever 7th year, witnessed Sam flinch at the mention of bedtime that she raised the alarm. Professor Flitwick, despite his small stature and cheerful demeanor, was not one to take bullying lightly. He conducted a quiet inquiry, discreetly questioning the other Ravenclaws who had by then grown tired of the prank. Though they laughed, there was a heaviness now, a quiet guilt that pressed into their ribs like cold stone. When the truth came out, Fred and George were summoned to Flitwick's office. There were no points deducted in front of the school, no public humiliation, just a long, serious conversation that, according to rumor, ended with Flitwick saying, "Just because it's clever doesn't mean it's kind." The twins never spoke of the punishment they received, but for once they looked genuinely sheepish. Sam, meanwhile, was moved to a smaller chamber adjacent to the tower. It was a quiet room, usually reserved for prefects or visiting guests, and the door had a lock that only he and Flitwick knew how to open. It was not a punishment, though to some it seemed that way. It was, in truth, a haven. Professor Snape, of all people, was the one who brewed the calming draughts for him. Though not known for kindness, Snape had a particular understanding of humiliation, especially the kind suffered in silence. Sam's course of potion therapy lasted a month. Each evening he would take a small vial of liquid silver, its texture thick like syrup, and within minutes the tension in his limbs would ease. Sleep came easier, though dreams still eluded him. Interestingly, it was Luna Lovegood, a first year at the time, who brought Sam his first real smile since the incident. She had wandered into the room by mistake, chasing what she claimed was a crumple-horned snorkack. Instead, she found Sam with a book in his lap and the remains of a broken quill. She sat beside him and said nothing for several minutes. Then she leaned close and whispered, "I once dreamt I was a narwhal. I think dreams are smarter than we are." Sam looked at her, blinked, and, for the first time in weeks, laughed. The spell on the pillow was broken, of course, but the echoes of it remained. For the rest of that year, Sam walked the halls with a cautious step. Some students still chuckled behind his back, but most had moved on. Hogwarts was a place of ever-changing chaos, and new scandals emerged daily. But to Sam the memory lingered like fog. Years later, in his final year at Hogwarts, Sam would go on to win the annual Ravenclaw Essay Prize for his paper, The Ethics of Enchantment, When Magic Crosses the Line. It began with a chilling line, "Not all spells are hexes, and not all jokes are harmless." The paper was read aloud by Professor Flitwick at a special Ravenclaw gathering, and it was met with thunderous applause. Fred and George, long graduated by then and running their successful joke shop in Diagon Alley, received a copy of the essay by Owl. They read it in silence. George eventually folded the parchment and said, "Well, I suppose we had it coming." "I still think the goose thing was funny," Fred muttered, but even he looked thoughtful. It's worth noting that the shop they ran, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, began labelling all enchanted pillows with a new warning. Not to be used on unwilling participants, may cause emotional damage. A small sticker on each product read, "Approved by Professor F. Sam Turpey," eventually became a magi-zoologist, specializing in dream-afflicted magical creatures. His work with the Ministry's Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures earned him quiet fame. He never publicly spoke about his time at Hogwarts, but in one rare interview with the Daily Prophet he mentioned, "Sleep is sacred. No one should fear it." A goose-shaped paperweight sat on his desk. The Snoring curse, as it came to be called in Ravenclaw lore, was no dark magic. It didn't maim or destroy, but it did unveil the cruelty that can hide behind laughter. It taught students a lesson more valuable than any potion or charm, that silence, when used as a weapon, is a powerful curse in itself. Even now, in the uppermost dormitories of Ravenclaw Tower, some say that if you listen closely during a thunderstorm, you can still hear it. I'm a magical goose, faint, distorted, like a distant memory refusing to fade. And somewhere in the castle, the portrait of Professor Flitwick chuckles softly and says, "Be clever, but never cruel." Number 26. Ink that rewrites essays. Fred and George Weasley had always been the type of boys who couldn't leave a quiet moment untouched. Mischief for them was not simply entertainment, it was an art form. From early on, they had an instinct for identifying their most studious targets, the ones who prized structure and discipline above all else. And if there was one student at Hogwarts who embodied that precise, no-nonsense attitude, it was Hermione Granger. The Weasley twins had recently begun experimenting with enchanted ink, a peculiar concoction of beetle wings, self-writing quills, and a dash of powdered moonstone. The result was a product they dubbed embarrassment ink, or as they secretly called it, snitch serum. Its charm lay in its subtlety. On the surface, it was indistinguishable from any other bottle of black ink, but once used, it slowly altered the words as they were being written, twisting the author's thoughts into bizarre and humiliating admissions. It was during a particularly heavy week of homework that Fred first noticed Hermione seated in a quiet corner of the Gryffindor common room, hunched over a stack of parchment. She was writing furiously, referencing 5 separate books at once, her quill darting like a snitch across the page. Professor Flitwick had assigned a 12-inch essay on the evolution of nonverbal spellcasting, and Hermione was determined to write the definitive response. She had already completed 16 inches. It was the perfect opportunity. The switch was flawless. While Hermione had gone upstairs briefly to fetch another book, George slipped into the seat beside her, removing her half-full ink bottle and replacing it with the doctored one. He even took care to dribble a tiny splash near the edge to mimic her own slightly messy use. She returned moments later, thanked no one in particular, and resumed her scribbling without noticing the difference. The ink worked slowly, almost imperceptibly. It did not scramble sentences or draw rude sketches in the margins. Instead, it nudged the writer's thoughts ever so slightly, diverting serious academic phrases into absurd statements. It latched onto subconscious impressions and magnified them into whimsical nonsense. Hermione, engrossed in her work, failed to notice. By the next day, she had finished her masterpiece. With the pride of someone certain of their brilliance, she turned in her parchment, tied neatly with a Gryffindor red ribbon. Flitwick, charmed by her usual excellence, read it first during his evening tea, and nearly spat his biscuit across the staff room. The essay opened respectably enough. The foundation of non-verbal spellcasting lies in the capacity of the wizard to project intent beyond the confines of vocal articulation. But then, without warning, it devolved. It is much like whispering secrets to the moon. For example, Levicorpus is a very romantic spell if performed under starlight, preferably with one's crush nearby. Flitwick raised an eyebrow. Further down, the essay claimed that Professor Flitwick, while diminutive in stature, has the most adorable ears I've ever seen on a man of his talents. They twitch when he's excited, which is highly motivating. And then, as if determined to dig its own grave, it proclaimed, Swish and flick is not only a wand movement, it's a lifestyle choice. Hermione's quill had not betrayed her. Her ink had. The next morning, Hermione was summoned to Flitwick's office. When she arrived, the professor was polite, but visibly flustered. He asked if she had perhaps allowed someone else to touch her parchment. She denied it. He asked if she'd had a late night or consumed anything peculiar. She glared. Then he handed back the essay. She read it in horror. Each sentence stung like a slap. Her cheeks flushed as she saw the phrase, casting silencio on a loved one can be seen as an act of affectionate mischief, provided they deserve it. Hermione looked up, betrayed by her own handwriting. The punishment was not official, but severe enough for Hermione. She received a private warning and nearly cost Gryffindor 50 points. In her mind, it was a scandal of epic proportions. She prided herself on academic perfection, and now she had unknowingly authored what could only be described as a love-struck, poetic disaster. The twins were conspicuously absent from the common room that evening. Rumour had it they were hiding in the owlery, laughing themselves hoarse while trying not to be seen by the prefects. They hadn't anticipated such a powerful effect. The ink had clearly amplified every buried thought Hermione had been suppressing. Not romantic ones, necessarily, but sentimental scattered notions, her fondness for Flitwick's gentle voice, her whimsical associations with spell names. The twins knew Hermione was too clever for direct jokes, but this was art. Days passed. Hermione did not confront them. That perhaps was the most terrifying part. She said nothing. She moved quietly, but the common room buzzed with her wrath. Even Ron muttered that it was safer to avoid speaking around her in case she hexed someone by mistake. Harry had tried to calm her down once and earned a glare that silenced him for an entire day. Fred and George, meanwhile, debated whether to apologize. On one hand, the prank had been too good. On the other, Hermione was one of the few students who could outmaneuver them in magical retaliation. She had access to restricted books and an imagination sharpened by revenge. They remembered the time she had jinxed Marietta Edgecomb's face. This was a girl not to be underestimated. Weeks went by, but the story refused to die. Levicorpus under the stars became a whispered phrase among first years. Someone charmed a quill in the library to only write in rhyming couplets about Flitwick's ears. Even Luna Lovegood made a comment during a DA meeting, musing that perhaps wand movements carried emotional resonance, especially if performed barefoot. Hermione endured it all in silence, but it changed her. She began keeping her ink bottles in a magically locked drawer. She cast detection charms on her parchment before writing, and, perhaps most noticeably, she stopped sitting near Fred or George in any classroom. The twins never repeated the ink prank. They considered it a masterpiece, yes, but also a dangerous one. Their joke had revealed just how thin the line was between cleverness and cruelty. They hadn't meant to humiliate her, not really. They wanted laughter, not fallout. But in the world of magic, even ink could be a weapon. In later years, Hermione would reflect on the incident with a mixture of fury and awe. It had been one of the few times she'd been outwitted completely. She never discovered how they'd managed the enchantment. No trace of magical tampering had been found on the ink bottle itself. It had been flawless. That, in some small way, made her respect them, even if she'd rather die than admit it. Flitwick, for his part, never mentioned the essay again. But during the next charms lesson he did smile slightly as he explained that non-verbal spells require focus, not moonlight, and then winked at Hermione, who blushed crimson and nearly broke her quill in half. It became part of the school's hidden folklore. Among the many tales of moving staircases and screaming portraits, Hermione's love letter essay gained a life of its own. New students heard distorted versions, that she had confessed undying love for Flitwick, that she wrote about snogging Ron while levitating, that she had tried to publish it in the Quibbler. None were true, but that was beside the point. Years later, when Hermione walked the halls of Hogwarts as Minister for Magic during an inspection, she passed by the charms classroom and paused. The light still filtered in the same way. Somewhere behind the walls, the echoes of laughter still lingered. She allowed herself a smirk, remembering the ink, the betrayal, and the absurdity of being 15 and furious. Fred and George, or at least George now alone, never told anyone the exact recipe. The formula remained locked in the back room of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes under a charm that required a riddle to open. It was simply labelled "For Emergencies Only" or "Weddings." And in a dusty corner of the burrow, a jar of jet-black ink still sat unopened, a handwritten note tied around its neck. It read, "Use responsibly or hilariously, but not on Hermione ever again. Number 27, staircase leading to a locked closet." It began, as most tales involving Fred and George Weasley do, with laughter echoing down the stone corridors of Hogwarts. The twins had long earned their reputation as pranksters of legendary scale, but even by their standards this was bold. Some would later say reckless. Sometime during the second term of their fourth year, Fred and George discovered the enchantment protocols woven into Hogwarts' enchanted staircases. With a bit of mischief-fueled experimentation and a stolen hour in the library's restricted section, they managed to tweak one staircase's logic ever so slightly. It was the third rotating staircase from the charms corridor, one known for its unpredictable turning. Fred slipped the hex in place during the lull between classes, while George kept watch. The idea, simple in its design but loaded with the chaos they so adored, was this. Any student moving too quickly up that staircase would find themselves redirected, not to the arithmancy wing, but instead down a shadowy, narrow passageway that ended at a forgotten broom cupboard near the old armour gallery. The door, once closed, locked itself for 10 minutes exactly. An enchantment cleverly borrowed from an old magical detention charm. It was meant to be funny. It was meant to be harmless. The first victim was Jeremy Twycross, a sixth-year prefect in Ravenclaw known for his punctuality and detest of foolishness. Racing to deliver an urgent message from Professor Flitwick, Jeremy dashed up the staircase and vanished from view. When he didn't return, Flitwick was puzzled. It was nearly 15 minutes later that Jeremy appeared again, pale-faced and dusty, claiming the staircase had eaten him. His tale was dismissed as an exaggeration, After all, Hogwarts did strange things all the time, but Jeremy's disappearance was not an isolated incident. The next to fall prey was Megan Ashcroft, a Hufflepuff third year with a gentle nature and an unfortunate fear of the dark. Her friends noticed her absence when she didn't return from picking up a forgotten textbook. She was found shortly after, pounding on the cupboard door in tears, her knuckles bruised from frantic knocking. Her screams had echoed faintly into the nearby Transfiguration corridor, which led to her eventual rescue. The incident might still have passed unnoticed had it not been for the third event. That one sent shockwaves through the school. First-year student Daniel Whitcomb, just 11 years old, was late for his History of Magic class. In his rush, he took the cursed staircase and was swallowed into the trap without a clue. Alone in the dark, with only the faint scuttle of mice for company, Daniel panicked. The cupboard was small, too small, and his panic blossomed into something far more dangerous. When he was finally freed, his breathing was erratic, his limbs trembling violently. Madame Pomfrey identified the signs at once, a severe panic attack. Daniel remained in the hospital wing for 2 days. This time, no one laughed. What had been a whimsical trick had teetered into dangerous territory. Rumors circulated swiftly. Some said the cupboard was haunted. Others whispered that it was a cursed detention room from Salazar Slytherin's era. But the truth came out quickly, thanks in no small part to Minerva McGonagall. The deputy headmistress was not one to tolerate nonsense, and certainly not when students' safety was involved. Once Daniel was stable enough to speak, he described the darkness, the sudden redirection, the cold iron latch that would not open. His story matched the other two. McGonagall's face, already severe, turned granite-like as she connected the dots. Her investigation was swift and unforgiving. Every staircase in Hogwarts was examined personally. Charms were tested and unraveled. Prefects were assigned to observe staircases during passing periods. For a week, all moving staircases were slowed to a crawl. The castle itself seemed to rebel under such restraint, groaning and resisting the magical probes. Yet McGonagall persisted. It didn't take long before the culprits confessed, or rather, were found out. A Slytherin fifth year, Ambrose Jugson, overheard Fred boasting to Lee Jordan in the courtyard. "Funniest thing you've ever seen," Fred had said. "Twycross flailing like a flobberworm in a teacup." Ambrose, eager for favour with staff, relayed the quote to Professor Snape, who, though no fan of McGonagall, understood the gravity of what had happened. The disciplinary hearing was held in Dumbledore's office, though the headmaster seemed more thoughtful than angry. Fred and George, contrite yet still sheepishly amused, stood in front of him. McGonagall's voice, tight with fury, echoed against the stone walls. "Your actions could have resulted in trauma, injury, perhaps worse. This is not Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, this is Hogwarts." Filch demanded they be expelled. Snape insisted on a month's detention. Dumbledore, after long consideration, assigned them to help Professor Vector recalibrate the enchantments of every magical staircase in the castle. "You've proven quite talented in adjusting magical pathways," he said, steepling his fingers. "Let's see if you can reverse the process." Though they grumbled, Fred and George complied. For 3 weeks they hauled ladders, scribbled arithmetic runes, and endured Vector's piercing glare. They learned more about magical architecture than most seventh years. They also learned to recognize when a joke turned dangerous. "We never meant for anyone to get hurt," George would later write in his school journal. "It was just supposed to be a laugh." That cupboard, room 117B, as it was later identified, was sealed permanently by Professor Flitwick. A protective ward now repelled anyone within 10 feet. The incident was quietly documented in Hogwarts' internal disciplinary records, and for the rest of the year, students gave the staircase a wide berth, regardless of its eventual purification. Among the student body, reactions varied. Some, like Percy Weasley, were outraged. "It's unacceptable," he told Penelope Clearwater over supper. "Absolutely criminal." Others couldn't help but chuckle in secret. The idea was brilliant, if poorly executed. A staircase that punished those who rushed, Hogwarts irony at its finest. Hermione Granger, always a voice of reason, made her thoughts known in a letter to her parents. Fred and George don't realize that magic has consequences, she wrote. Even if you don't mean harm, it doesn't mean harm won't come. Ron, torn between brotherly loyalty and concern, avoided the topic. Harry, who had once himself been trapped in a trick staircase on the 3rd floor, remained silent. But he too had passed that corridor and felt a chill. It was perhaps Draco Malfoy who best captured the mood, though unintentionally. Leaning against a column near the Great Hall, he was overheard saying, "Leave it to the Weasleys to build a magical trapdoor into a mop closet. That's about their level of architectural sophistication." The sarcasm lingered, but so did the truth. The Weasleys had indeed constructed something unique, but it was a reminder that Hogwarts, for all its magic, was a place where boundaries mattered. Years later, when Fred and George opened their joke shop in Diagon Alley, they displayed a miniature replica of a staircase with a tiny cupboard underneath it. A relic from our formative years, read the plaque. "Warning, do not run upstairs while chewing bubble gum." The incident, though largely forgotten by the time Harry returned for his 5th year, left a mark on Hogwarts. It prompted an overhaul of moving structural spells, a renewed emphasis on student safety, and an unspoken understanding among pranksters. If you're going to play with the magic of the castle, be prepared for the consequences. And perhaps most haunting of all, though the cupboard remained sealed, some students swore they still heard knocking from within on quiet nights. A trick of the wind, or the echo of a joke gone too far. Whatever the truth, the legend of the staircase leading to the cupboard lives on, carved into Hogwarts folklore like a cautionary tale. Magic, laughter, and danger, all entwined in a single, ill-fated step. 28 Anti-Gravity Potion in the Great Hall. Of all the legendary pranks pulled off during the chaotic and colourful years of Fred and George Weasley at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, none stands out as both spectacular and infuriating as the day they unleashed the anti-gravity potion in the Great Hall. It began, innocently enough, as many of their antics did, over breakfast on a drizzly Tuesday morning during their 6th year. The sky beyond the enchanted ceiling was grey and brooding, matching the mood of most students still shaking off sleep and grumbling over lukewarm porridge. But for the Weasley twins, that mundane atmosphere was the perfect canvas. The potion in question had been brewing for weeks in a hidden corner of a disused classroom on the 4th floor, disguised under layers of disillusionment charms and protective hexes. A pale, opalescent liquid that shimmered with swirling flecks of gold, it had been inspired by an obscure mention in Magical Drafts and Potions, Volume 3, a textbook that even Professor Slughorn had once described as a collection of half-baked ideas and dangerous whims. The anti-gravity potion, though, was precisely the kind of dangerous whim that Fred and George lived for. They had tested it, of course, on a stack of textbooks, a school bag, even on a very irritated Nasal belonging to one of the Ravenclaw prefects. The potion worked, but only for 20 minutes at a time. Still, that was more than enough. Their plan was as simple as it was daring. Spike a few pitchers of pumpkin juice just before lunch, wait for the chaos to erupt, and watch the floating hilarity ensue. By the time students began to filter into the Great Hall, the trap had been set. The enchanted ceiling above mirrored the fading storm clouds of the outside world, while hundreds of floating candles cast a warm, flickering glow over the long tables. As the benches filled with students from all 4 houses, nobody suspected a thing, not even Hermione Granger, who was usually the first to notice any deviation from the norm, caught the faint shimmer hovering over the drinks. "There's something off about this juice," she would later mutter to Harry and Ron, but by then it was far too late. The first sign that something was wrong came from the Slytherin table. A 4th-year student named Malcolm Bletchley had just taken a large gulp of juice when, to his horror, his feet lifted slowly from the ground. His fork followed suit, then his napkin, then his entire body began to float upward like a balloon freed from its string. The hall erupted in gasps and laughter as Malcolm hovered 6 feet above the table, flailing his arms in panic. At that precise moment, the potion's magic spread like wildfire. Dozens of students who had unknowingly sipped the enchanted juice began to rise, some gracefully, others with wild, jerking movements as they tried to clutch at the edge of the tables or their friends. Cutlery clattered to the floor as plates, goblets, and even entire serving trays began their slow ascent. One Gryffindor second year was seen clutching a floating bread roll as though it were a lifeline, while two Ravenclaws floated past each other in stunned silence, like celestial bodies drifting through space. The most dramatic incident occurred when a terrified Hufflepuff first year named Daisy Montford, who had only arrived at Hogwarts a few weeks earlier, shot 10 feet into the air before colliding with one of the grand chandeliers that hung from the enchanted ceiling. The impact sent golden sparks and candle wax showering down upon the students below. Daisy screamed, flailed, and then lost her grip. Her descent was swift and wholly undignified. She landed headfirst into a vast communal bowl of mashed potatoes at the Hufflepuff table, sending white clumps of potato flying in every direction. Her robes were soaked, her hair covered in gravy, and her pride irrevocably damaged. Professor McGonagall's reaction was swift and fierce. Standing at the center of the hall, she cast a sonorous charm on herself and shouted for all students to remain calm and return to their seats, though it was a futile demand, given that many of them were airborne. Her stern features were flushed with fury, and the sharp lines of her mouth trembled as she watched a group of third years perform unintentional backflips near the enchanted ceiling. Professor Flitwick, despite his usual calm demeanor, looked as if he were on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He scurried between floating students, casting counter-charms as quickly as he could manage, muttering incantations under his breath in a frantic whisper. "It's a violation of magical equilibrium," he was heard to say repeatedly, sweat beading on his brow. "Gravitational constants are not to be tampered with in dining areas." The chaos lasted for exactly 23 minutes. One by one, students began to descend, some gracefully, others with sudden bruising impacts as the potion wore off. A pile of shattered plates near the Gryffindor table told the story of an entire treacle tart that had plummeted to the floor, narrowly missing Seamus Finnegan's head. Ron Weasley, who had floated upside down for most of the ordeal, finally landed in a heap atop Neville Longbottom, who hadn't touched the juice but had spent the incident hiding under the table. "Do you have to be so dramatic?" Hermione snapped at Fred afterward, her arms folded tightly across her chest. But Fred only grinned, a smear of buttered peas on his collar and a look of unrepentant glee in his eyes. George, standing beside him, shrugged and replied, "We call it elevated dining." That night, the twins were assigned 2 weeks of detention and banned from entering the kitchens unsupervised, but the story spread like wildfire. It was whispered in the common rooms, scribbled in the margins of spellbooks, even referenced in Professor Binns' droning lecture the following week. An unfortunate example of magical misuse in modern history, he had called it, before promptly forgetting the names of everyone involved. Even the Daily Prophet caught wind of the incident, running a small column in the Oddments and Oddities section. The article read, "Levitation lunacy at Hogwarts twins tip gravity on its head. No serious injuries reported, but several egos bruised." For weeks afterward, faint gold sparkles lingered in the ceiling beams of the Great Hall, remnants of the potion's chaotic magic. Professor Flitwick claimed it would take months for the charm residue to fully dissipate. Some students swore the candles burned brighter or floated higher, or that their toast now drifted slightly before landing on their plates. Fred and George, undeterred, considered the incident a rousing success. "It could have been worse," George insisted one evening in the Gryffindor common room, brandishing a scroll of new potion formulas. "We almost added a laughing draft to the mix." "And then you'd have people floating and laughing while they crash into things?" asked Lee Jordan incredulously. "Exactly," said Fred. "Comedy gold." There were a few, though, who never quite found the humour in it. Daisy Montford, despite emerging from the mashed potato bowl unharmed, avoided the Great Hall for several days, preferring to eat her meals in the Hufflepuff common room. She eventually returned, but only after Professor Sprout personally escorted her and promised that the potatoes would behave this time. The staff convened an emergency meeting that evening where Dumbledore reportedly found it difficult to suppress a chuckle. "Ah," he said, his blue eyes twinkling behind half-moon spectacles. "Youthful inventiveness, though perhaps best expressed outside of mealtimes." That phrase would be quoted years later, etched into a brass plaque above the kitchen entrance. Youthful inventiveness, best expressed outside of mealtimes. Even years after Fred and George had left Hogwarts, the tale of the floating lunch was passed down through generations of students. New first years would arrive in the Great Hall, look up at the towering ceiling, and whisper to each other about the time gravity failed. They would ask, "Is it true someone fell into the potatoes?" And older students would nod solemnly. It became a rite of passage, a part of Hogwarts' living mythology. The prank was retold with added embellishments that Professor Snape had floated upside down into a pudding bowl he hadn't, or that Dumbledore had levitated intentionally to enjoy dessert among the stars he certainly hadn't. But the core of the story remained the day Fred and George Weasley defied the laws of nature and turned a simple lunch into a surreal airborne ballet of laughter, horror, and mashed root vegetables. And in the end, perhaps that was the true magic of it all, not the potion itself, but the memory it left behind. A moment of levity, quite literally, that captured everything chaotic, beautiful, and unpredictable about life at Hogwarts.